I'll just start off with an introduction. I'll go back briefly. My name's Paul Laurent down here. What Oracle really uses me to do is basically I go around the country and I steal good ideas. So I only work with public sector customers. I do all of North America. I'm sorry? Well, see, that's a beautiful thing about public sector. There's no such thing as plagiarism if it's paid for with taxpayer dollars. So if somebody else is trying to solve a problem that you're trying to solve and they're doing a good job with it or they have a better idea, why reinvent the wheel? So essentially, what I do is I very seldom see my house. I come home and just wave to my stuff periodically. I'll be filing my taxes soon, and I'm thinking of using O'Hare International Airport as my home address. But what I really do is go around to other states and state and local, tribal, as well as with the feds, and I try to figure out what are the problems everybody's wrestling with and what are the elegant solutions and the solutions that we should all be considering when it comes to addressing the same sort of problems. So by way of introduction, there is the word security in my title, so for access management, that's an important part for this. And I think another thing we're going to do that, from sitting through the day, talking to a lot of you and attending some of these sessions, I think we'll spend some time at layer 8 of the OSI stack today to talk about access management. Anybody know layer 8? It's the political layer. So we'll talk a little bit about why access management creates so many problems for us and why we have so many fits when it comes to mobile in state and local government. And it's pretty important. And why is it so important? Well, one of the things that Oracle also uses me to do is I get involved with a lot of standards development organizations and a lot of groups. I participate heavily with NASIO, so Digital Identity Group. SciCam Working Group was a part of that. That's concluded now. Security and Privacy, as well as the Healthcare Working Group. And another group I participate in is I'm on the Management Council for this, if anybody knows what Nstick is. By show of hands, how many people have heard anything about Nstick? So it's relatively new. The date down here, if you can't read it, is April of 2011. That's when this thing kicked off. It was originally, it stands for the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. And what we're trying to do with this is something that came out of the Cyberspace Policy Review from 2009. And one of the things they said was we need a way to securely manage identities and data transfer for everybody in the United States and hopefully internationally as well. But interestingly enough, even though this issued, and that's the little White House logo down there, this was a White House initiative, this is actually private sector led. So when we get together at these large meetings that they have here, there's one coming up in May in Mountain View in conjunction with Internet Identity Workshop, we get together and talk about how are we going to get away from the bad practices in the past that have created all these problems for us. As we understand, how many people are aware that we've had a problem with advanced persistent threats as a result of the Mandiant report and the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal coming out and saying we've been hacked and all these other things. The way identity theft and the way identity failures and hacking exist right now is largely as a result of the fact that we used username and password for so long as our primary means of authentication. So what this attempts to do is to fix that problem, and because it's private sector led, it shouldn't be any surprise to people that private sector's thinking heavily about mobile as part of the way to fix this identity problem. Part of the way to put hardened credentials in there and multi-factor authentication and step-up authentication. But that's not the reason I bring this up. The reason I bring this up is when this thing first kicked off back in 2011, we had a lot of discussions. There's a lot of people, a lot of who's who in the tech space. You have people show up from these big identity providers. It's not just the vendors you see here, but it's also the people that, the Visas, the Neiman Marcuses, and all these other retail and financial services and things like that. I was making an argument at one point that really at the end of the day, state and local government has to play a much more important role in this whole discussion about how we do security and how we're going to extend proactive citizen services. So by show of hands, how many of you have one of these? Keep them up. Of those of you that have your hands up, how many of you, and I guess you don't have to put them down, but how many of you are U.S. you're natural born U.S. citizens, not naturalized? I would bet, if I had any money to bet with, that over 90% of you that had your hands up right there gave a state and local issued birth certificate as proof of citizenship, and you gave a state and local issued driver's license as proof of identity. At the end of the day, when people want to talk about the feds or somebody like a LexisNexis to come in and do identity proofing and get to that whole question about access management and who you are and how we're going to manage these things, we only know who you are, even the State Department, because of who state and local says you are. You people in this room, by what we come to know people with all our different touch points across the state of California, You are the clearinghouses for human identity for over 12% of the US population. That's why this is so important. And when it breaks down, these are what I like to call table stakes. This is what happens when we don't manage. We are the stewards of public trust. We are the people that at the end of the day answer that question, who are you? And we're the most definitive answer for it. I know there's been a lot of headlines from South Carolina, a lot of headlines from Utah that hit particularly close to home with us. When we start talking about extending mobile access, for anybody who got a chance to look through that Mandiant report about basically advanced persistent threats, they look for one single point of entry and then they just work their way laterally through an entire organization. And public sector is one of their favorite targets. So different discussion for a different day. But at the end of the day, these are what I consider table stakes. This is the ante for playing in the public sector space. So when we talk about mobile access management, we hear a lot about it. You have an entire conference for mobile, right? And the reason why we keep hearing about it, well, there's that mobile and social promise, right? I'll just tell you, spoiler alert, that a lot of these are not the drivers that come out of public sector. Sure, we would love to have anytime, anywhere access, and we'd love to have this idea that, hey, any device I want to come at, I can hit any data that I want to come at. But we have challenges that keep us from getting to these points, but we keep hearing about it. Why? Well, look at what the private sector's done. 90% of companies in a study saying that they're going to have mobile apps by 2014. 62% of companies going to be using social networking to connect with customers, and a lot of those people are doing it mobily. So our constituency has changed what the definition of keeping the lights on really means. So there's a lot of people. We were having a discussion down in the exhibition area earlier about, I was approached by some kids who live on my block that explained to me none of them have email addresses. Because for them, if they want to get in contact with each other, they have social networking, they use Facebook as a primary point of connection, and these other ones just text each other. I don't know his phone number, I just put it in at one point, and that's how we contact each other. So from our standpoint of delivering proactive citizen services, we're coming to a point where the thing that we used to use as primary identifier for so many systems that were public facing, because we couldn't use things like social security number and other things like that, we're going to have to think of something else. Because to a millennial right now, if it doesn't come in iOS or Android, and this is, I feel bad about this, seeing as Google just retired Reader a little while ago. Apparently the RSS feed maybe will slowly fade off of this slide at some point. But for all these other things, like, can I reach out with a 311 system? Can you give me text alerts? Are there ways I can give you a proactive warning? And, think about simple services and other things like that. Can I hit it? Can I subscribe to your Twitter feed? To a millennial, if it doesn't exist in one of these platforms, if it's not mobile, it's not relevant. Because not a lot of these people are sitting there and firing up an x86 box at home and staying chained to these individual things. They're busy texting while driving or something. I don't know. Just throw in whatever assumption you want to make about that. So the definition of what we have to do, how we keep the lights on and provide those services, has changed. But I'll give you another example here of why it's changed and why we simply can't go down this private sector route where we're just going to throw up 90% of us are going to have mobile apps in place, in a year from today. This is one of my euphemisms. I use a mnemonic device for this. I guess it's BCBC, but I'd like to think of the challenges we face in public sector as having 4 walls. So the 4 walls of public sector, and I'll explain them all: budget, charter, bench, and communication. I think everybody's pretty familiar with budget. I think I told you guys I come from the Chicago suburbs, so maybe we can sit in good company here, because I think per capita, when it comes to state budget deficits, per capita we might have you beat. Because we're pretty close, but again, we have nowhere near 12% of the US population. So, and they get to do interesting things like when we have a couple swan song senators at the gubernatorials, no, they're not coming back for state elections. Funny story from 2010, depending on which side of the aisle you sit on, increased the state income tax 66% in the 11th hour as their last act. Thank you. I guess we weren't busy balancing our budget. We were too busy figuring out how to send the next governor to jail. But anyway, so everybody knows what it's like to feel that they have to stretch dollars, and sometimes, we're trying to extend proactive citizen services. Occasionally we cut corners. We don't always do things to the level of specificity that we would like to do or be as productive as we would like. Everybody understands budget. I think we can move on. Yeah, good example there. It's just so you guys also feel good again, in the Chicago suburbs, it was 80 degrees this time last year. I still have snow on my driveway right now. So Feel better about that. Charter. This one's a little bit harder to describe. When we talk about applications and when we talk about how we serve our constituents, there's a lot of things that every one of the departments in the state does, and we just replicate as we go around from department to department. Everybody has employees, everybody interfaces with citizens. We don't necessarily share our interactions with citizens, our understanding of who those citizens are. So you may be in the best position to figure out that you should be the logical repository for doing identity proofing for the state. There's normally 3 big centers of gravity for that. It's usually whoever manages driver's licenses, health and human services, education, and occasionally we'll have some other big benefits groups that at the end of the day, between those big 3, you have a pretty good picture of who each individual in the state is. But because of legislation, and definitely because of budget, it may not be your job, so you're just going to paint over the carcass and not worry about it because nobody told you that you had the legislative capability to do that. Isn't Layer 8 fun? So how many people here are with state agencies? All right. How many of you, get those hands up again, that are with state agencies, how many of you only wear one hat in your job at work? That's right. Wait, you kept it up for a while. You only wear one hat? Okay, we can talk about that later. Most of you are being asked to do all sorts of things that you probably weren't brought on to do, and generally the first hat that they give you is a firefighter's hat. The only reason that public sector stays afloat as we go into these days where general fund dips, nobody gets their projects funded, we see double-digit reductions in IT budgets, is because of what I like to call the superhero team. If it wasn't for the people that run public sector, nothing would happen at all. There are people running around with capes and leotards and things like that, figuratively, that go ahead and keep public sector alive and well. And that's going to be a big one, Bench, when we talk about some of these barriers. And then communication. And this is not necessarily just talking about how we extend things like mobile access. Part of what this is talking about is how we talk to each other. There's a lot of sister agencies out there that we could learn from their experiences, and we could do exchange of service. We could do all sorts of things like with the collaboration of data and exposing shared services, as long as we have a foundation for that. That makes it feel like we're talking across 2 tin cans on a piece of string. So those are kind of the 4 walls that affect this. So what's the pace been like of mobile adoption? Well, I said I spent a lot of time with NASIO. I engage in a couple of their working groups, and I'll be headed out shortly to the mid-year conference and all this other stuff. Well, every year they put out this survey. This is basically from the 2012 State CIO survey. They'll have the 2013 usually ready by the year-end conference. And the question here as they're talking about this is, let's talk a little bit about mobile devices. And one of the notes they had about this when it came to these primary objectives of state CIOs and what they're seeing in their states, direct quote, "Mobile devices and applications are no longer a novelty, but half of CIOs say their efforts to manage them are still fragmented. Citizen use is already exceeding expectations, and continued expansion is the obvious course." So we're getting lapped a little bit, but let's delve in. So what does that really mean when we start talking about it? And this may be a little bit hard for everybody to read, but I'll call out the salient points here. The question here is, how's your state managing mobility? So 12% responded, it's totally fragmented and uncoordinated. 38% said a few coordinated government-wide projects and initiatives, but mostly fragmented efforts. 15%, about half of mobility projects coordinated, half are uncoordinated. 25%, full quarter, said mostly coordinated government-wide projects and initiatives, a few fragmented efforts. And 6%, I like to call this the delusion factor, all mobility projects well-coordinated or government-wide. The caveat to that maybe is that they have no government projects for mobility, so therefore they're all coordinated. Coincidentally enough, I'll also make a point that there's another point in the survey that talks about when it comes to bring your own device, 6% of states do not allow BYOD by a rule in the state for that. So I think there may be something to that correlation with numbers. And 4% is the don't know, do not apply. That makes me feel good too. So, I'm sorry, what was that? CIO? So here's kind of an interesting statistic. And this is a year-over-year analysis. And I think this really gets at what we're wrestling with from the standpoint of how we're doing mobile on a state basis. This is 2012, this is 2011. The question asks, how would you rate the readiness of the CIO organization to deploy and support mobile devices and applications? I like to think that this is a learning curve because we had 37% said they were gosh darn good and ready in 2011. We had about the same number of people in 39-38 who said we feel relatively neutral about this. We had 24% who said they're completely unprepared. As best I can tell, from 2011 to 2012, about 8% figured out just how deep a water they were actually in. So I'll give you another quote off of this one. This was one that came from a specific response to this, and I think this is particularly telling because as I go around and miss my home and things like that and talk to people about what they're doing with mobility, this is what I hear. We're ready to support devices, but we're not ready to develop and deploy apps. And one of the reasons why this comes up, we're having problems addressing skill gaps, dealing with risk management, and keeping up with rapidly evolving technology. Putting my crystal ball reading hat on here for just a second, I'll give you some sort of notion. What I see in a lot of states as well is this idea that there's big consolidation efforts. A lot of people talking about this at this conference today about, you know, if you're within this purview for this branch of the state, thou shalt move into a state data center, thou shalt stand up combined services and those sorts of things. Part of this consolidation effort is the idea of how do we continue to do more or do the same with less. If we shrink our IT footprint, if we shrink the FTEs necessary to go ahead and support that IT footprint, and if we put people into an area where we should have economies of scale, this kind of goes along with those lines. Bring your own device, I don't think, has taken on so well in so many of these public sector organizations because they're a bleeding edge in terms of BYOD. I think it's happening because this is a cost recapture effort. And I think there's a reality component to it as well. Some people just refuse to hit that thing from anything other than their iPad. That's the reality of it. You'll see it through all walks of life. Some people get wedded to the technology. It's certainly a love affair for a lot of people with Apple products and with a lot of Samsung products. I think that's another reality component to it there as well. So definitely not to pick on the respondents, but I think that's part of the factor here as well. So we talked a little bit, I underlined that thing about risk management here. And what I'm trying to call out here when we talk about risk management is, you know, you kind of have this continuum where we talk about, you know, I think I'm about to, I think I need a weapon of a higher caliber here with my laser. You know, you have a continuum of what we're able to provide people, here represented as SLAs, and then we have trust. And the interesting thing about when we start talking about mobile users and extending this, especially to a large external population, is that we've got people where traditionally, when we think about risk management, we have very low trust in their capabilities to be secure and our ability to basically keep them into realms of data and realms of interchange that we feel safe with, but we also provide a similarly low SLA. And then we start talking about, we have people that, how many people have had telecommuting initiatives go into place? And like I said, I deal with the federal executive. It was a very unpopular week to be around when the sequester went into place. A lot of people, even in Department of Defense, which used to be, you know, verboten to touch their budget, told me, oh, you know what, we got to cancel that Friday meeting because I'm off. So we have people basically getting furlough days. We're relying more on telecommuting, especially in areas where you've got a wide geographical constituency and a lot of people that you have to work with and work for and provide services to. Mobile becomes a necessity. And then we have a consultant base in a lot of cases. People where we, you know, one of the ways that we go and we scale up to that IT gap in terms of skill sets is we bring other people inside. And then we've got our traditional thought about, you know, our trusted enterprise users. So we got higher trust there because we control so many more pieces of the puzzle. So what we end up doing in terms of SLA, we can go ahead and provide something more there. But if you think about it, what we're really talking about is that people want to talk about and touch the data that's relevant to them. It's going to break this paradigm. This linear correlation won't be there, and the reason why, think about what the table stakes are. I mean, really, I talk to guys that work in the commercial sector for Oracle, and it's funny because, you know, we always talk a lot about, you know, governance, risk, and compliance, you know, sexy stuff. But what they're always trying to tell me is that we don't have the same sort of requirements in public sector that they do in the commercial realm. And I laugh and I say, that's right, we actually enforce ours. Because if you guys were doing, I remember everyone crying in 2002 telling us how Sarbanes-Oxley was going to grind every publicly traded company to a halt. That's why we have guys sharing passwords and putting $8 billion in positions of the largest bank in the world out there without them able to track it. Sarbanes-Oxley did such a great job. But think about the stuff that we have to deal with. We've got, yeah, now we know what the phrase too big to fail means, right? We have health data, we have financial data, educational, personally identifiable information, things that cops and boot suits and triggers deal with. How many of the agencies that we talk about, when we talk about providing benefits, how often are we getting defrauded? And on top of that, I talked about that example with advanced persistent threats. What they're really after at the end of the day, yeah, they'd like the data, but the way they get to the data is they steal credentials and identities. And you're talking about leveraging more of this stuff that goes further out. So what this really applies to at the end of the day is our ROI, which ROI everybody recognizes as, right? We're public sector. Here it stands for return or risk of incarceration. Because the worst days in public sector start with your name or your agency in the papers or with basically a camera and a microphone pointed in somebody's face. So at the end of the day, what our real return is, we don't worry about being in the black and being in the red. What we're really concerned about is how well do we accommodate the public trust and how well do we provide proactive services? And a lot of you, how many people feel the pain of any one of these things that's up on this board in terms of this right column here in your day-to-day business, right? This is something we deal with every day. And it's not going away because as we have less and less money inside our general fund to go ahead and provide some of the services that we used to provide, we find people going to Uncle Sam. So another interesting thing you'll see at those NASCIO conferences, you ask them what the biggest concern on most of their minds are for the past 2 years, it's all been healthcare initiatives. HIX, HIE, integrated eligibility. Anybody know why? The only people giving out money. So that's how we go ahead and end up funding these things. So now if you want to go ahead and apply either to participate in a federal program or receive grant funding that's attached to one of these programs, they will ask you, what does your strategic plan for security look like to secure HIPAA high-tech data? If you're in education, FERPA and free and reduced lunches. Every state followed your lead with the exception of, I think, 3 now. It used to be 4, and I think the Mariana Islands may not have one. But breach notification laws, you guys have 2 versions of that. In fact, there might be 3. There might be a private, there might be a public, but everybody basically boilerplates your language. And then when we do eligibility determinations with federal tax information, bad guy data, so on and so forth, this is one of the barriers that we have to worry about when it comes time to think about how do we extend mobile access. So how are we doing mobile access now? Well, there's fragmented access for security, so we certainly have a proliferation of devices unless you've standardized on devices, in which cases then you see the people walking around with multiple devices. Occasionally you'll see the guys that have the BlackBerry and the Apple and nobody has to raise their hand. Just out of curiosity, does anybody have a flip phone? You go to conferences like this, I usually find at least one. We've built, we have to deal with all these things, all these compliance regulations and requirements. One of the problems that mobile presents to us is this idea that we already have a security. How many people, by show of hands, are in what you feel is a pretty heavily regulated department? Okay, can I ask? Graham? Oh, sure. So IRS 1075 people, you've got all sorts of stuff running across there. You probably have state laws that dovetail on top of that as well. Eligibility determinations there as well? Yeah. Okay. Well, there we go. Remind me not to fall behind on any sort of... But you basically put into place, for your compliance requirements, you put into place an entire security infrastructure. And what this paradigm does is it asks us to go ahead and extend that. Well, maybe we're not prepared and know how to do that and keep that security picture in there. And then we're already talking about the idea that we have limited FTEs to go ahead and support this sort of stuff. It's this whole notion of you're asking me to do more with less, do the same with less. I'd be lucky if I do anything with less. So what we're trying to do is figure out how do you simplify that? What's the right way to do this and maintain our compliance reporting? Because for a lot of these funded agencies, that's one of these things that can become a showstopper. What else? Well, what about from the standpoint of our end user? That could be both the internal user as well as the external user. We're starting to get back to that feel of Web 1, Web 1.0, where you used to just keep clicking on different things, but now it may be you deploy an app and you have to keep re-authenticating. The only difference here is that now you're doing it instead of one of those loud spring-loaded keyboards. Now you're doing it with that little thing on your phone or something like that that some people are ungodly fast at using, but I'm still playing catch-up on that one. This goes along the same lines with the FTEs. We got a help desk that's going to scale up to this, and how many people have experienced any sort of, first off, just by show of hands, I haven't asked this at all. How many people currently have mobile applications deployed within the department or within their org? Pretty small number. Okay, so maybe you guys haven't had those help desk calls for this yet, but I bet you have them for something else. And really, it's just another way of restating that login experience. And this is probably the biggest barrier for public sector right now. Experienced developers and people that are able to stand this up in a way that we feel, remember when we talk about access, we're talking about security, so it's not just that confidentiality, it's the integrity of the data and it's the availability of the data as well. To maintain all three of those things and get developers experienced enough to do this as they're juggling hats and throwing different hats on and off, what we really come into is a lot of people that have gone down this path, at least in the NASIO realm that I've talked to, end up coding the security into the application. We end up with brittle interfaces. It makes it very difficult to update and continue down that path. And this is a big one here as well. So when we talk about when we get to that information access, the one I really want to just kind of plug into here are these two bottom ones at the bottom. It's that notion about security and how do we monitor that access, because compliance is such a big requirement for so many of us. So in a perfect world, I'd be able to stand up here and give you all the guidance and direction and specs, and they would be very prescriptive and all these other things, and say, well, somebody's already gone and put out a cookbook out there that tells you exactly how to do all this. Unfortunately, this is one place in public sector where we're definitely in need of some catch-up. So what I have here on the left is this is NIST, Special Publication 800-124, which you will notice as of today is still in the draft status. And this is only from, I believe, October 2012, I want to say. Guidelines for managing and securing mobile devices in the enterprise. I will note that's talking about device security, a BYOD consideration. There are prescriptions that come from NIST that talk about how you would extend those shared services and mobile services and consume things, even in regards to how you leverage, because a big initiative in the federal space is taking third-party credentials, so the Facebook, the Google logins, those sorts of things. I'll touch on it briefly. There is guidance on how you go ahead and leverage that, but this right here is just talking about the device itself. This is a little bit more difficult to read. This is another NASIO document. It's Security on the Edge, Protecting Mobile Computing Devices, and this comes from 2009. There's not a lot of guidance is what I'm really trying to get to on this, at least in regards to talking about mobile in a very small microcosm. There is, on the larger scale, when you talk about standing up these services, there is a right way to do it, and there are specs that tie back to your compliance requirements, your funding requirements, and if that's that could be an entire web series conversation that we could talk about later on if anybody wants to come up and discuss it afterwards. But what I'm trying to get at here is there's no small, concise tome of data that tells you exactly where you go to go ahead and leverage these mobile devices. I talked a little bit about some of those other requirements here, and I'll just tell you why I think there's good news on the horizon for this. It used to be, if you went back 3 years ago, and I think we stole a little bit of the thunder talking about some of these notions about why people are building out health insurance exchanges and health information exchanges right now, is because they have funding timelines and deadlines that are expiring, and they were the only buckets of money out there to go and chase. Interestingly enough, so I'll walk you through kind of here very briefly. There's something called FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, that they wrote these things back in 2002 that talked about security controls. It's one of the things that the National Institute for Standards and Technology wrote a security playbook, wrote a shared services playbook, and all this would be applicable to mobile access as well. Just ported it from the idea of we have a different interface here as long as we have the security controls. It's interesting, there's two interesting side notes here. We talk about the Department of Homeland Security. Anybody remember Mark Weatherford? So he was, what was he, Chief Privacy Officer here a little while ago? Yeah, and then he went to the North American Energy Regulatory Commission. He went to NERC. And then he became Undersecretary for Cybersecurity for DHS. So just an interesting one there. I met with him back in 2006 when he was in Colorado, and he was the first state CISO to tell me, at the end of the day, we're all going to end up playing by NIST security standards. It's just a matter of time. They'll use the bully pulpit to get to that, and they'll use the purse string to get to that. Another interesting one here, Cyber Command, I really bring attention to this. It's actually headed up by General Keith Alexander, but you guys know who the CIO for DoD is now, right? Terry Takai? Yeah, so a lot of California connections in here. DoD used to have a role their own because, you know, basically if you're the guys that drop bombs on things, obviously you can't use anything developed for anybody else. But I think even what they've come along with is the idea that this set of standards, I apologize, it must look like I'm having a seizure over here. But this set of standards, and if you really want to see what those security standards look like, there's two basic documents that you could start with those special publication that's guidelines for applying the NIST risk management framework. And then there's a set of controls in something called 853, which is security controls for FISMA reporting. But even DoD is following this now. And you guys know that budgetarily, they just took a big haircut. So nobody is immune to this whole idea of this. And we've had a couple intrusions. This is supposed to mean basically our critical infrastructure protection. So power and water and all those critical things. They're starting to go along the lines of this NIST guidance. So what's this thing down here on the end? I think everybody knows what it is, but why is it up there? When I was a kid, and it's not just specific to the state of Illinois and the state of Wisconsin, but you used to be able to go up to Wisconsin and legally drink at 19 years old. There'd be a lot of people who would get in the car, drive up to Wisconsin at 19 and go ahead and tie a couple on and have a good time. And there was a big push when I was younger to basically standardize on a 21-year-old drinking age. And federal government said to Wisconsin, they said, you know, we'd really like to see you turn this to a 21 and over state for drinking. And the state of Wisconsin said, beer made Milwaukee famous, and we're fine with the out-of-state revenue, and we think it makes us special. And they said, you're right. It's completely within your rights, the state's rights. By the way, we have $0 in federal highway funds for you. And I think it takes about 48 hours and 2 lunch breaks to get that law changed. That's what's happening now with federal funding that's forcing everybody toward the same set of controls. So at the end of the day, when we look back on this and say, what do we get together and talk about here? This is the why we do it. We talked a little bit about how we do it. Now let's start getting into some specifics. This will be a deep dive architecture, 342 slides on nothing but Oracle. This is about as technical as I'll get. But really what you want to do from this perspective, and the way that you take into consideration the idea that we're strapped in terms of what developers can do, we're strapped in terms of how much control we can exercise over the actual devices, and we still want to improve interactions, is we want to go to this layer of the tier. Whether people are coming from web-fied applications or mobile apps that we've developed, or if we want to honor something that comes through some sort of social identity context, we should be coming in through the same door, any access. User engagement should be the same, and then we can make a determination at this point, and built on this foundation of identity management. All these other things are just there to talk about, these are common services that we provide within an architecture, within an enterprise, within an organization. But if we can make that decision at this point, and we can standardize out there, we can start talking about, well, what's our tolerance for risk? Am I managing child support? Well, if you're trying to get into an application that just basically says, you know, you're checking for time and labor tracking or something like that, you're one of my internal employees, I probably don't need as much authentication as I would think as if I'm saying, hey, I've got somebody that's an at-risk child and then there's a criminal investigation ongoing to this and we think there may be a situation here. We're going to have to go ahead and scale these. Same thing in the healthcare arena. If what we're looking at is somebody just wants to have a context to start looking at what the health insurance exchange is supposed to do in terms of what's the insurance layers that are going to be afforded to me, that's a little bit different than saying, I need this test performed, I need these lab results back, this is what my doctor said about X or Y. So basically the way that we see this in that other world, you know, the one that has a beer mug at the end of this, is that if your Department of Natural Resources and all people want to find out about is when are the hiking trails in Desolation Wilderness open and where do I go ahead and apply for a permit, and you're the people that control, here's the weak spot in the dam, here's the confidential informants that are tracking drug runners going across the border, here's the people that understand how to get through security at some of our airports. Some are going to be up here, some are going to be down here. We make that decision at this point. The beautiful part about this in practice, though, is that it still enables us to do everything below that barrier, everything that we've already been doing down here, to extend our security infrastructure and still do it the way that we understand our core competencies where we need to maintain compliance in those elements. So what's the net at the end? What are the 3 bullets here? I want to make it a better interaction, both for my internal employees and for citizen services. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have citizen and constituent services that matter to people, if we don't make things easier, and I think this was Terry's quote from back she was at Michigan. So she had a quote there where she said it's that whole idea about getting people online instead of standing in line. And there was an old AMVA quote around the same time that came out that for everybody that could renew, so this is just a cost recapture idea, anybody that could renew a driver's license based on their driving record and information could do it online, cost me $1 to do it. Anybody who comes into a brick and mortar shop, cost me $8. That's part of how do we start doing this smarter? How do we start standing up more in proactive citizen services? How do we mitigate risk? Well, I would argue that if we start going below this area, if we start trying to make decisions either at the endpoint or if we start letting this push into our native applications, our ability to mitigate and manage risk goes away. So there has to be a way to do this and still allow us to do what we do down here. Now, if you were, one of the top 5 tech firms in the world and so on and so forth, you may have a creative piece of IP that will allow you to start extending this out. You probably have a hand in what exists on people's phones, unless you're carrying the Razr phone that nobody in the room seems to have. But anybody with a smartphone, a feature phone, that idea to delve back into there. And at the end of the day, we can't do that because we can't develop that IP. We're just trying to keep the lights on. That's what state and local is doing right now. So we have to figure out a way to do this in an architecture and in a way, and coincidentally, this is an approach. Okay, this is an idea that somebody else has come up with that isn't proprietary. This is how you would do it no matter what architecture you run. So how do you get to that point? Well, it should be standards-based. So this is something that the federal government actually figured out when they started down the path of a related topic about federation. Every one of their agencies, they said they have people that work there, they give them credentials to access stuff, and then they have a way of managing that access. If you rip and replace any of those items out from these living, breathing, bureaucratic organizations, they bleed all over the place and things start dying. So what they said was, is we find the piece that we can go ahead and standardize on. Well, in the case of the way that we do this stuff, we talk about the right approach to doing mobile. You want to stand up things that are standards-based and that we can easily extend. So an API for security, an open API for security that we can extend is one. Leveraging some of the authentication protocols that are already out there. How many people familiar with step-up authentication? This is a fantastic idea. It's what this thing on the right side basically is here. Remember I gave you the example of if you were, I think I might have used hiking trails, but let's say you have a bus schedule. And if every time Aunt Tilly comes to my portal, I have something to do with Caltrans or something like that, all she cares about is a BART schedule or something like that that's specific to her. You know what happens when most citizens come in and you ask them to create a new account so they can log in to your page and have customized look, feel, or information? About 70 to 80% of them go away and never come back. So they're not interested in standing up yet another account that they're going to forget the password to and they're going to forget all this stuff. What the idea that we're toying with here and what we're seeing federal government has already embraced this is this notion of step-up authentication. What step-up authentication is let's say you've got a mobile browser or any other sort of browser open and I'm already logged in with an active Facebook or with my Gmail account or something like that. The browser can pick that up and a mobile browser can pick it up just as well and say, you know what, I'm not asking you to pay your taxes. I'm not asking you to go ahead and sign an affidavit for something. All you want is a customized look, feel, so I can give you a more valuable mobile experience through your phone that tells you only the things on your route that you care about. And so I can give you a list of information. What step-up authentication does is it just says, hey, would you like to log in with your Facebook account? And then it just basically asks Facebook, we trust enough about the way, using these sorts of things like OAuth and OpenID, we trust enough about the way you manage identities to at least trust it to give them a bus schedule. Then we have a context. Now we understand this is Aunt Tilly, she's looking for the BART schedule. Now if she comes back and decides she wants to pay a ticket or wants to do something else that maybe requires a credit card or some sort of step, what we do is we step up the authentication and say, we're going to ask you a couple questions based on what we already know about you. We're the state. It's like I said earlier on. Nobody knows individuals in the United States better than state and local government does. So if you already have a context for them, we can just ask a couple more simple questions. For them, it's next to painless. We can ask them 2 or 3 simple questions. I'll give you another couple examples here. But that's where mobile and social interact. It's a great way to go ahead and provide a more proactive service to people that's less painful. And now we start to understand a little bit about what they consider useful from us. And I talked about Web 1.0. We shouldn't have to keep doing this notion of signing on every time we hit a new, not even a new site, not even a new app, just a new service within an individual that a department has stood up. So logically speaking, you know it can't be a tech conference unless you have a logical architecture in here somewhere. And I'm going to walk a little bit over here just for a second. What we're trying to get at here is, remember I talked about that idea that whenever somebody comes in, it should always be, we make one determination point. We don't care whether they're coming from a mobile browser, whether they're coming from a desktop, an iPad. We make that determination over here. Now, the way we would do it is basically if it's a native application, the easiest way to do this for our developers and the way that causes the least pain for them is we don't want them to touch application code on the back end. We just want to expose an SDK so they can go ahead and make that connection with minimal changes to anything else and keep your security infrastructure the same way it was. If it's a web app, we're likely already extending it in regards to a web app as it is. If you guys are trying to put stuff from the mainframe out onto people's mobile devices, good luck. You know, just let me know how it goes. It's not impossible to do, but I'm just saying for only one person raised their hand for having these things. But most of these things are typically exposed as web apps, right? Web apps and web services. Well, if you're familiar with REST, so that idea of basically REST-based APIs, REST-based interfaces, what is that, relational state transaction? I think is what it is. But basically, this is a very simple open standard way of communicating through an API that doesn't need customization to go ahead and be heavily customized, to talk through a web interface. And then this is where what I guess we would call a policy enforcement point would go in. So what we're trying to do here when we talk about the way that we would approach this as Oracle, or as I see some states approaching this, is the idea that you want the determination to be made here, and we want to be agnostic. We don't want to care about whether or not somebody's coming in from a device. What we want to care about is the idea of, we understand you're coming from one of these three things, and because it's open and it's standards-based, now I'm just going to make a determination. Now's the point where I care. So, your iPhone jailbroken? Yeah. Well, I got some apps you can't touch then. You want the bus scheduled? No problem. I can go ahead and give you some access to some of these other things. And the idea basically of this gap here for access management is that you already have, I guarantee, you already have access management somewhere in your enterprise. You gave people credentials to do something. At some point, you make a determination about, hey, can this guy really do that? Well, you're going to make the same determination. It'll maintain your compliance considerations. We just want to come in a very agnostic, non-intrusive way, and we don't want our developers to have to go ahead and develop anything special on the back end that'll make our applications fragile or make them break. What's interesting here, and then this is where it does start becoming about what I think Oracle brings to the table, is there's a whole bunch of other services that, as a result of things we can determine about what you're hitting, where you're coming from, these devices. I'll delve into these. If you can't read them, basically device fingerprinting and tracking, device registration, what happens if somebody loses a device or has it stolen. It's no longer the backup tape now. Now it's always an intern. I don't know who's giving interns all these backup tapes, but we can do it by your GPS or your Wi-Fi location. I mean, we can do geolocation with that. And then knowledge-based, risk-based, and one-time password. I'll delve into all of those. But the idea at the end of the day is that this is risk analysis and mitigation. That's the way it should be stood up. If we can remain agnostic over on this end here and at least get these ideas about, hey, we know you can come in and we have the tool in place to go ahead and make those determinations about things like where are you coming from, what sort of device, what's your typical behavior like with this device, then we can start saying, it's fine to come in on your phone. I can start making intelligent decisions about whether or not you should really be accessing the criminal history information records. So what does that look like? And I'll step through these rather quickly. Part of the idea here is that, you know, as we go through these different things, maybe just a username password would be fine. If you think in that federal space, or if you're involved with anybody in healthcare? Yeah, no? Well, in the healthcare space, it's a hot topic right now because everybody's trying to solve some of these issues. If it's Aunt Tilly with the bus schedule, I can take a username password authentication. If I want to have a context for it, maybe we go ahead and trust some of these other logins and some of those people that also do OpenID and OAuth. You'll notice Twitter is on there as well as Yahoo, LinkedIn. So there's a lot of services you can go ahead and leverage this from and provide that meaningful context to them. But what we're also trying to do here is that, so suppose we want to do knowledge-based authentication. And I'm sure everybody's dealt with these before. My favorite story about this one, you remember when Sarah Palin got hacked? It turns out it was like a congressman's son. Anybody know how he got into her email, her Yahoo account? Yeah. So the funny thing about it was where did you meet your husband? Well, when you come from a town of 4 people, And it's well publicized. So he basically spent like 2 minutes on Google and 3 guesses to get into her account. But for the rest of us, it works fine. So no, but actually you can take feeds from other services like LexisNexis and like, I'm forgetting some of the other ones, not Moody. Anyway, you can take feeds from some of these other ones to customize those questions. And remember, who's going to know things about places where you lived and addresses better in the state than probably the state? And then we can also do this. I'm sure a lot of people do this with their banking. How many people get where they send you an authentication code so you can finish logging into something? So we call that one-time password. So it's two-factor authentication. So you're already logging in with username, password. But now it's that idea of it's something you have as well. Well, you had to have the phone for me to send it to you, so that's another way to get hardened authentication there. So for a lot of those advanced use cases, you can even stand up some things that go to those higher levels of what even the federal government would require for some things in the healthcare arena, for example, and the tax arena by doing that one-time password option. A whole idea here, single sign-on. So we should be able to honor the tokens and the credentials that come from the back end of the phone, whether or not it's going to be an application you develop for mobile, whether it's a web app that people are consuming through mobile, and they could have been consuming it through something else, or whether it's a custom app developed. So I think in the interest of time, because I can hear some stuff, I'm going to pass through the login flow exactly what that would look like if you wanted to do one use case. If anybody wants to come and catch me afterwards, we can step through this as well. We talked about compliance. So we just talked about a lot of stuff for the users. This is for your security folks and for your compliance people. We're going to need to be able to report on all this stuff. If you're going to extend a tool that makes it easy for this to be consumed in that manner, it's only common sense that for a security professional, you would want to have the statistics and you would want to have the information on the back end. This is another way that we can also do hardened authentication. If we've got somebody that, he typically only logs in from this county or this IP range, or he only uses this sort of stuff from this area, and then all of a sudden I get him going into a really sensitive application from the Republic of Albonia, 26 hours later, and the phone has been completely gone. That might be a red flag, and I might want to challenge for a higher level of authentication. And then let's talk about what we can do for our developers, because this is really where the rubber hits the road. It is the hero team. If we can't do something for the hero team to enable them and give them the tools to go ahead and stand up, biggest things that we can do for this is to provide them the toolkit to go ahead and start writing for iOS, Android, to give them those native libraries. But the biggest thing to take away from this is that we want to be able to build this in without wrecking the native application code on the back end. So we can do it with SDKs, we can do it with RESTful APIs, and build in basically all the other controls that we need to do so our access management isn't going to become cumbersome on the people who are developing the apps. I can hear people outside. You guys can read a summary slide on your own. I want to make sure I at least open the floor for questions. Sure. Yeah. So, I think, I know that we're also recording. One of the things is if, I think in the past, they've made this available through the website. If not, I can definitely make a PDF of this available to anybody who wants to ask, and I'm pretty sure they make it available as well, but if you just want to be double sure, suspenders, belt, that stuff, come grab my card and I'll make sure I get it to you. Anyone else? Well, I never want to stand in the way of a reception. So thank you everybody for showing up, and if anybody wants a card or anything, I'm more than happy to provide it. Thank you.